As we get closer to the March 24th meeting in Saudi Arabia between the United States and Russia, and interestingly, also possibly the United States and Ukraine, all in the same building. We'll talk about that more later. But in the meantime, Ukraine side is looking not to the United States for rescue, but to Europe, because they see that Trump is not interested in continuing on the operations and not in continuing the support, whether it's intelligence or otherwise. So he's looking more to Europe, and European Union is very keen on providing that. At least they are at the word level and at the leader level. But as we get into more of the action level, well, things started getting a little bit more dicey. And to try to explain some of that about what's really going on behind the scenes, we have Alexander Mercouris, co-host of the Duran, and just one of the big fans of this show, of where you're a big fan, and our folks are big fans of yours. Thanks for coming and joining back with us today, Alexander.
I am a huge fan of this show. Let me make that absolutely clear. I consider it indispensable watching, and I've learned huge amounts from it. And it is a joy and a delight to be on it again.
And all that is mirrored back on our side. That's why we love having you on every week. Before we get into some of the details of this here, I just kind of, it's been a while since we've had you on, and I wonder kind of what your thoughts have been since Trump had the phone call with Putin, and Zelensky wanted a 30-day, well, U.S. and Zelensky wanted a 30-day total ceasefire. Trump wasn't able to get that. He got allegedly a limited ceasefire of no hitting energy infrastructure. More on that in just a second. But just the fact it's coming out that Putin basically didn't give Trump what he was looking for, where do you think that leaves us right now at that level?
I don't think we should read too much into this. I mean, it was clearly a long call, and in some respects, I suspect, a contentious one. I can imagine Trump coming in saying, I want a 30-day ceasefire. Putin pushes back. He says, my army is advancing. I don't trust the Ukrainians. I don't want this to become a frozen conflict. What are the guarantees, if I give you a 30-day ceasefire, that the Ukrainians will honor it, or that we won't get bogged down in interminable negotiations that are going to lead nowhere? So a contentious discussion. But the key thing, the most important thing, is that the two sides agreed, the two presidents agreed, that they were going to set up expert groups, that they were going to talk with each other, that the United States is going to be directly involved in the negotiations. And that is absolutely crucial, because if it was just Russia and Ukraine, it really would go nowhere. So I'm actually cautiously optimistic about this. I think that discussion got us about as far as it was realistic to expect that it would go. And if I could say, I did a program just before that telephone conversation took place, and I basically said over the course of that program on my channel that if we got something like this, something very like what we eventually got out of that meeting, out of that conversation, that would be considerable progress. So I'm cautiously optimistic. I'm not saying, we're there. There's massive obstacles lying ahead, but President Trump is clearly keen to end the war, and that is a huge step forward. President Biden and his team showed no interest in finding a way to end the war. President Trump is interested in ending the war. That is a huge thing. And President Putin is responding. And there's now going to be this meeting in Riyadh, and there's expert parties and those sort of things. So that's my general take.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the things I wanted to point out, because whether this, the idea that you're going to get a major give on one phone call is not very common. I guess it was always going to be possible. But the fact that they're talking, and the fact that the Russian side, in its readout and its discussions afterwards, also said it was a very positive thing. And they were very glad, specifically to your point, that unlike the previous administration that wouldn't even talk, had no interest in ending the war, at least now they are. So they do seem to be on a good point. now then the problem's going to come in, the devil's in the details, as they say. And this first thing that was agreed to, this partial and limited ceasefire, even that is already appearing to go off the rails. This news coming out today is that there was a lot of attacks overnight, really from both sides, that both sides accuse the other of violating the ceasefire. Specifically, energy targets have been hit on either side. Gary's actually got some amazing and troubling video from some of this stuff that's been going on both sides. And I mean, we're talking like within 36 hours and some even less than that. Do you think that even this can hold? Because in order to get anything to happen, you still have to have confidence building measures. And well, this doesn't seem to be building much confidence.
Well, I think it demonstrates the fact that we're seeing these things, sites, shows that Putin was absolutely right, and that accepting an unconditional ceasefire wasn't going to work, because ceasefires, almost by definition, between warring parties have a tendency, an ability to break down. It's something that is in the nature of ceasefires. So you need monitoring mechanisms. You need people to observe things. You need enforcement mechanisms as well. I think too much is being made about whether or not this ceasefire is going to succeed, what it was, and all of that. The major thing for me is not this ceasefire, which I don't think anybody on any side really expected would, hold for very long. The big thing is that they're getting up the expert groups, that they're meeting, that they're talking, that the Ukrainians are going to be in the room, and out of that something may come. No conflict as complicated and as intractable as this one, involving so many parties, is going to be settled by one telephone call. So we have a negotiating process, and it started, and I consider that a positive development, a very positive development.
Yeah, and I know you have a lot of experience on negotiations of really various kinds, and so one of the reasons I was glad to have you on today. And I wonder if this whole drive of the European Union and Zelensky to try and get a lot more money, I want to see how you think this is going to factor into it. First of all, I want to show you, this is what Zelensky's talking about, what he wants right now. I think this was yesterday.
So it's crucial that your support for Ukraine does not decrease, but instead continues and grows. And this is especially true for air defense, military aid, and our overall resilience. We need funds for artillery shells, and would really appreciate Europe's support with at least 5 billion euros as soon as possible. Investments in weapons production are needed both in Ukraine and in your countries. Europe needs technological independence, including in weapons manufacturing. Everything necessary to defend the continent should be produced here in Europe.
So it seems to me that he's looking for things to get his own side done. But when you're talking about investments of $5 billion, there's another possibility out there, or another program that's being discussed of, I think, $40 billion, something by the European Union. These things are all long lead times. This is not going to have any impact at all on the war right now, as we're talking about negotiating it into it. So in your view, how does this play into the negotiations to end the war, or is this separate?
No, I don't think it's separate at all. I think this is absolutely part of Ukraine, Zelensky trying to maneuver ahead of the negotiations. My own sense about Zelensky, and I've said this many times, is that I don't think he welcomes this negotiating process at all. He's somebody who basically, for all kinds of reasons, wants at least some kind of war to continue, because I think his own political future hinges around this. So when he's talking about these enormous sums and about, weapons and manufacturing facilities and all of that continuing to be sent to Ukraine, to me, that is dangerous. It suggests somebody who is still keen on prolonging the war. It seems to me more like war talk than peace talk. You would expect Zelensky at this particular time to be saying, it's wonderful that we're managing to talk now. Let's see what we can do to consolidate the ceasefire, the very limited ceasefire that has been agreed, and instead he's coming up with these kind of proposals. So I don't think this is a promising sign, but I'm afraid it's no more, dare I say it, than I have come to expect. President Trump, I think, put it very well when he said previously that the support of the United States has disincentivized the Ukrainians from seeking peace. And of course, what Zelensky is now trying to do is, because he can't get that support any longer from the United States, he's trying to get the Europeans to take the place of the United States. And if that happens, the effect will be the same. It will disincentivize Ukraine from seeking peace. The practical realities are exactly the ones that you said. The Europeans aren't able to provide him with the level of support that he's looking for, certainly not in any short term. But that is what I think this is about. And I think that the negotiators, President Trump, the Russians obviously, need to be very wary and aware of all of this.
Well, so now let me ask you a question, though. Let's stick on the Zelensky portion of this for the moment. So he doesn't want, I mean, his actions make it almost certain that what you just said is accurate and true, that he's trying to keep this from going to the negotiated settlement. And he's talking to Europe to want to get this, all these packages, et cetera. He sees the thing that he physically asked for, that we're going to show what Kajakalis said about that in just a second. But you see that those are all very long lead time, these situations. He doesn't have a long time. So where is the value for Zelensky to say, I don't want to have a negotiated settlement now. I want to look to this other thing here. And there's not a mechanism or a method to get him from here to there where he'll survive as a country. How does that work?
Well, it doesn't work, and that is the reality, but it is a reality that he has consistently been unwilling to face. His entire diplomatic strategy for several years now has been to try to involve the West in the Ukraine war, because that is the only way that Ukraine, he believes, could achieve the complete victory, which seems to be the only thing he's willing to settle for. So he wants a weapons production to continue, money to continue to be sent. He wants to prolong the war. He wants the Europeans to eventually send their troops to Ukraine. And I think he still hopes that if that happens, he can get the United States back in the game, involved on his side, fighting him alongside the Russians. Now that sounds incredible, but it is consistent with what he has been trying to do for a very long time now. And from his very narrow perspective, which is a Ukrainian one, it has a kind of logic. He doesn't want to negotiate. He doesn't want to surrender the territories. He doesn't want to compromise the Ukrainian national project, of which he is currently the trustee, if you will. And he can only achieve that objective by involving the West in the war. And that's what I think he's trying to do.
Well, I on a very narrow basis, I can certainly see where that thought might occur to him, but the actual building of the bridge to survive long enough to make that happen is a separate issue. Now, we can sit here and say, well, roll the eyes kind of situation on Zelensky. He's been detached from reality for a long time, but it's not supposed to be that easy for European unions who aren't in that seat to have that same delusion. And yet, in terms of this $5 billion, here's Kajakalis also yesterday talking about it, and you're going to see some problems.
For Ukraine, I've proposed initiative to really go with the ones that President Zelensky needs. Ammunition in amount of 5 billion. So we should at least start to have a really concrete step, not only words, but also in deeds, that we are helping Ukraine right now. Because the stronger they are on the battlefield, the stronger they are behind the negotiation table.
Okay, I want to camp on that last part she said there. The stronger they are on the battlefield, the stronger they are in negotiating position. That implies that she believes, and presumably many others at the higher echelons of the European Union, that there is a path, this bridge that I just talked about, to create a strong enough force on the ground that will start to either push back the Russians or to make them fear something, to make Putin think, holy cow, we better negotiate something that they want or we could lose or something. Where is that bridge?
It doesn't exist. I mean, this is the reality of it. I mean, I know you've been pointing this out. Well, not just for the last few months, but basically for the last 3 years. A bridge to a Ukrainian victory, a military victory by Ukraine, simply does not exist. But there are still people, Zelensky, for example, and Kaya Kallas, who simply will not face that reality. And, you know, in the case of Kaya Kallas, it's important to remember that she's from one of the Baltic states. For the Baltic states, Russia is the overwhelming reality that they are confronted with. They've been under first Soviet rule and then Russian rule before. They are very, and understandably, very, very concerned that the Russians are coming back in some form, and they count on the West to prevent that happening. So when they talk about, you know, we must send ammunition, we must send weapons, we must do all of these things, you can up to a certain point understand where they are coming from. People like Aya Kallas. The trouble is, what she says, she's talking in theory on behalf of the entire European Union. I'm going to say it straight away. I don't think many of the European states actually agree with those sentiments, certainly not anymore. But people in Ukraine hear them. Zelensky hears her words. And I think it is extremely unhelpful because it makes people like Zelensky think that if he goes on asking these things, the Europeans will give them to him.
Gosh, it's hard to even make sense of all of that because I part of my brain gets the logic of what you said about the desire, you wish it, but there's always this pesky other part of the brain that actually sees reality, that recognizes this is a pen and it's kind of hard. And even if I wish it was like wobbly where it would bend, it just isn't. So I can wish it all day long. And if I take action, assuming that this can bend, what I'm going to do is end up breaking it and I'm not going to have a pen. At what point does, you talk about bridges, the bridge between those two parts of the brain come together? Because you see that's the one part that I've just shown you here. Here's another one from Kaya Kallas from a couple of days ago, to where she's actually talking like she's in the power position over Russia.
The ball is in Russia's court, and what we see right now that Russia doesn't really want peace. And also what was understanding around the table is that Russia can't really be trusted. So they will, seize this opportunity to present all kinds of demands. And what we already see, they are presenting demands that are their ultimate goals. So let's see how this develops further.
So she's kind of like trying to shame Russia, like saying, they don't want peace. And I'm just saying this to shame them so that they'll realize that once the gig is up, now then they'll start to have peace. And they're making these unreasonable demands. But that's where we get back into the pen, because it is a pen. Russia does have the cards. They do have the leverage, and they don't have to give in to these points. They can press for maximalist outcomes. And if they don't get them, they'll keep fighting. What part of that do some of these people in Europe not get?
Well, they don't get it. And I think this is an important point because, of course, if they did get it, eventually, of course, they will get it. I mean, you can go on denying this. You can go on resisting this reality for a while, but sooner or later, that reality is going to collide with you. But when that happens, they will be confronted with something that they've not wanted to confront for many years. Basically, since they achieved their independence, which is that in order to prosper and be secure and safe as independent states, they need to have a good relationship with Russia. That the West cannot ultimately organize reality on Russia's border in a way that suits people like Kaya Kallas or indeed Zelensky. Now, they're not ready to accept that because they want relations with Russia to be on their terms. Just as you said, for the moment, the fact that that might not happen, that they might not get that wish, is something that is extremely difficult for them. It inverts their own sense of reality. It requires them to make compromises and to come to understandings with Russia, which they don't want to do.
So I want you to put your negotiating hat back on and give me some insights into what may be going on behind the scenes, because away from the cameras and the microphones, when they're just having private, frank conversations, one would imagine that even in the Kaja Kallas camp and the Keir Starmer camp and Macron and some of these others, they may be saying, okay, look, I mean, we do have the Austrian State Treaty, Finland's independence to look at, and they prospered quite well with the Soviet Union. There are plenty of ways. We don't have to surrender our freedoms or anything else. We just have to say that there's not going to be a military alliance arrayed that poses any kind of a threat to Russia. So we can go down that path. But if we go down this path that we're saying in front of the cameras, it ain't going to work out well for us. But yet they have so far. How does that work inside when you know, okay, if I keep going down this road too much further, I'm going to run into where there's no bridge and I'm going to fall off, or I can take this path. I don't want to do it, but at least it can actually work for me. How does that work inside?
Well, what should have happened long ago, and unfortunately hasn't happened, is that, and the major blame here lies with the European states, the big European states. They should have made it very clear long ago to the Baltic states and indeed to the Ukrainians that this policy that they were pursuing, this refusal to acknowledge the reality of their own neighborhood, simply doesn't work, and that they do need to start having discussions, proper, substantive, long-term discussions about their security with the Russians. Unfortunately, that never happened. And in the case of the Baltic states, admitting them to NATO, unfortunately, reinforced these beliefs that they don't have to compromise with that underlying reality. Now, what needs to happen, if we're talking about the Baltic states and the Ukrainians, is that somebody has to have a frank discussion with them. And that is why the involvement of the United States in the current negotiations, the ones which hopefully will settle this war, is so important. Because realistically, it's only the United States that seems capable of holding that kind of discussion, that is able to tell the Ukrainians, look, this has gone as far as it can go. We can't go further. We can't go beyond this. We are not going to go to war with Russia so that you can achieve your maximalist demands, so that they can tell to people like Kaja Kallas, look, we can't go to war with Russia in order to appease your entirely understandable and legitimate concerns. The involvement of the United States is the most important aspect of this negotiation. It's what makes me cautiously optimistic. And the fact that the United States is going to be in the room, and the fact that the United States is telling every party that it wants to settle, is the most positive sign. Because deep down, all of them know that without the United States, this game that they've been insisting on playing simply can't be played. That applies to the Europeans. It applies to people like Kaja Kallas. It applies to the Ukrainians as well. I should say that according to some media reports, the Financial Times, for example, already there are dissident voices in Kiev which are saying that Zelensky is simply not being realistic, that there is already some movement within the Ukrainian political system. They're saying the Americans have made it clear where they want this to go. And in the interests of our own country, of our own survival, we have to adapt to that reality. One mustn't assume that Zelensky talks for everyone in Ukraine.
Yeah, I can validate that that's the case, because I am talking to others in Kiev, and what you say is absolutely validated by the sources that I have, that there are a growing number of dissident voices that are grumbling, even within the inner circle of Zelensky, we'll see what success that has. But outside of that circle, outside of Zelensky, even, it's not just Kaja Kallas is also not speaking for everybody in Europe. And we're already starting to see just right away. So those comments I just showed, some of them were from yesterday from Kallas and from Zelensky. But then the news out today is saying, look, even Italy and who was the other one? France, I think, are already balking at this. And they're saying, hey, yeah, about that $5 billion, how about no? Because we have a lot of our own issues here. And you see this, this larger package of $40 billion, that's stalling too. So even on this camp that's within Europe, without the United States, they're already starting to go, yeah, I don't know that we're going to actually come up with that.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, I think this is a moment that was eventually going to come. Now, just to say very quickly, I have a great deal of understanding for Kaja Kallas's position. I mean, historical understanding. I mean, obviously don't agree with it, but I understand why Kaja Kallas might feel about Russia as she does, and I can understand why Kaja Kallas has the positions that she does. I have no such understanding, or at least no such sympathy with the position taken by my own government, which is that of Britain, which has been, in my opinion, extremely unhelpful. My Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, has been trying to set up this coalition of the willing, as he calls it. Inevitably, that was going to collide with reality very quickly. We are starting to see that. And we're now starting to see countries which have always been more skeptical about this affair than they have wanted to let on, such as Italy, speak out against it. And we're starting to see divisions in France come to the surface, divisions which have always been there and which are to be found within the French government. In France, in Italy, they will accept the realities far more quickly. Remember, France, after all, is the country with the concept of raison d'etat, the idea that, you take policy, you take a realistic approach to policy. The French were exemplars of this sort of thing. So it's not surprising that we're starting to see glimmers of that tradition return. And Italy as well. So we're going to start to see pushback. We're going to see people say, does it really make sense for us to give another 5 billion euros or dollars or whatever it was to the Ukrainians to start sending them more ammunition at a time when the Americans are trying to make peace? Shouldn't we really be getting behind that? Shouldn't we be supporting that process? How does this support this process? And besides, given the dynamics on the battlefield, which you have discussed many times and very brilliantly, Daniel, if I may say, given the realities on the battlefield, isn't that throwing more weapons and ammunition away, more good money after bad? So this descent towards what you like, the foreign policy orthodoxy coming from London and Brussels is going to intensify.
And, one place where it's already quite robust is one European head of state, which could easily join us on this channel. And I invite him to do so if he ever has the desire to do, because he would fit right in with literally every word you're saying. And that is Viktor Orbán of Hungary, who absolutely nails reality here.
Az amerikaiak föladták, illetve az amerikaiak rájöttek arra, hogy az előző adminisztráció egy felelőtlen kalandba rántotta bele az Egyesült Államokat. Az új elnök azt is mondta, hogy legyen béke, és történt, ami történt, vagyunk, ahogy vagyunk, de állítsuk meg az öldöklést, és kössünk egy tűzszünetet, majd tartós békét. Az európaiak nem adták föl azt a tervüket, hogy a NATO-t beviszik az oroszok hóna alá, és továbbra is az előző forgatókönyv szerint haladnak. Ezért ma elválik egymástól stratégiailag mindaz, amit az Egyesült Államok képvisel, meg az Unió. Az Egyesült Államoknak van ereje, az Uniónak nincs ereje. Az amerikaiaknak vannak eszközeik, az Uniónak nincsenek eszközeik. Bármit akarunk csinálni, csak hitelfelvételből megy. A hitelek meg egyre csak halmozódnak, és maguk alá fogják temetni az Európai Uniót, ezt nem lehet csinálni. Tehát ezért az Unió ma egy fogatlan oroszlán.
And look, I mean, he's not saying anything that's really radical. He's talking about ways to preserve power for the European Union, to not get into more debt, to recognizing that the U.S. is going this direction. It's not the old administration where it was going along with the herd. Now then you have the leader going in a new direction, and the herd hadn't figured it out yet, but they need to pretty quick. Number one, for their own self-interest and their economic self-interest, but number two, for the reasons you just touched on a second ago, was that their capacity, their military capacity, is already significantly shrunk from what it was before, and they don't have the capacity to do anything more. Ergo, the military battlefield conditions can only deteriorate, and at some point, they're going to have to come to that conclusion, but he's already there.
He is absolutely already there. Now, I was in Hungary in November, and I was very privileged to be able to meet with various quite senior Hungarian officials, including people in Orbán's office, but also people from the various ministries, from the energy ministry, from the finance ministry, from the economics ministry, ministers who are not directly involved in the conflict. They're all saying the same thing. They were very articulate and very clear. It was very impressive, actually. The entire government seemed to understand this, to get this very well. And they were making this point to me. We are not pro-Russians. This is not what we're about. We fought the Russians 6 times. There is no tradition in Hungary of being pro-Russian. This is absurd.
And actually, I'm sorry. I want to go down that path for a second. I didn't know you had been there. I'd have asked this question earlier.
Yeah.
You talked about, you can understand how Kallas and the Baltics, how they view about things, given their history, etc. Hungary has a history also. The 1956 invasion from the Soviet Union is one of the more painful ones here, and yet they seem to be on the side not of Russia, but on the side of just, hey, this is just how it is. Why is there a difference between Hungary and the Baltics?
This is an excellent question and not an easy one to answer. First of all, I talked to people in the government. Perhaps there are other people in Hungary who take different views. Maybe it was a different experience. But I'm going to suggest that there is a deeper reason, and that is that Hungary has a long history as a great European power. Now, we look at Hungary today. We look at a nation of, 15 million people, I think it was. It's a relatively small country, but it wasn't that always. And as recently as the early 20th century, it was part of the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. Budapest was an important center of international diplomacy. Hungary has that tradition behind it of foreign policy, of maneuvering as a great power. And I think that gives them a better understanding and a more profound feeling of the wider realities than some of these other European countries, East European countries like the Baltic states do. So I think that's as good an explanation as I can give you. I'm not fully sure why Hungary is different. And one must also allow for the extraordinary personality of Viktor Orbán, who is an extraordinary man. I mean, incredibly erudite, apparently a workaholic, somebody who is always reading books, taking an interest in foreign policy, visiting countries around the world, listening to what people say, and has that world experience that, to be frank, you don't find in the Baltic states.
Or Western Europe, for that
Western
matter,
Europe,
or the United Western world. Honestly, although Trump is certainly playing a good bit of that role now, being willing to talk to everyone. Remember how much heat Viktor Orbán took last year, rather, because he talked to both Putin and to Zelensky and a number of other leaders. He's willing to talk to anybody to get to peace, and he was roundly condemned for that. But we need a lot more of it, I think.
Well, can I just say that was a massive missed opportunity. That was a chance for the Europeans to get ahead of the game. I mean, this was before the election, but Orbán went to Moscow and Beijing, and by the way, Washington. And instead of supporting what he was trying to do, the European Union tried to undermine it, and that was a terrible mistake. And we've been behind the curve ever since, when actually we could have been ahead of it.
Yeah, yeah. And unfortunately, we didn't have the guy in the White House who was willing to take advantage of it and probably was as upset as other European leaders. But, we keep talking about what the reality on the ground is and what these disconnected things are from some of these European leaders. But there's some others, even in the United States, even to this day. Just a couple of days ago, I'm going to show you something that one of the retired U.S. Army generals said, which I just cannot understand. And I'm going to need some help on this one from Gary. So, Gary, if you could pop back in here, Gary's real good at some of these things. On this clip here from General Ben Hodges, who was going to talk about you talk about reality. He's going to talk about something that any objective analysis on the ground in Kursk about how Ukraine has lost it. They were driven out. Now they have a couple of fields still that are still hanging on by their fingernails, but that's about it. Russia's already moving into the Sumy Oblast. And he was asked, I think by a Ukrainian interviewer, what he thought about that. And I expected him to say something like, well, it's unfortunate the way it worked out, but the Ukraine side eventually lost and got pushed out. But he has a different take on it.
Ukraine was in there in course since last August. One of the most, I think, effective strategic moves made by the Ukrainian side of the war. It accomplished a lot in terms of changing the narrative of Russian invincibility. It created strategic problems for the Russian side. And the Russians had tried for months to eliminate this bridgehead, but they never could. And then all of a sudden, at about the same time that the U.S. administration cuts off intelligence, cuts off aid, the Russians are able to accomplish what they had not been able to do for the previous 6, almost 7 months.
Okay,
Danny, you can't blame the guy for wanting to celebrate a battle, right? He doesn't want to celebrate the war, but he can celebrate the battle.
Well, okay, but if he's going to celebrate the battle, he's got to be accurate about it. He's just trying to put lipstick, not even on a pig, but like on a roasted pig. I mean, it's dead and cooked, and he actually says some things. But there's 2 things I want to point out about there. One is he said this was a big success for Ukraine because it changed the narrative, and that word is important here, because it punctured the idea of Russian invincibility. But did it? Because Russia did kill everybody who went there or drove them back into Ukraine. So how does that damage the role of Russian invincibility?
Well, quite. I mean, it's an absurd idea. I mean, I come from outside the world of military and wars and things, but it seems to me that what matters in war is not whether you're puncturing myths of invincibility, but winning battles. I mean, this battle has been lost. I mean, to talk about it in any other way other than as a defeat in a war which Ukraine is already losing is absurd. Now, I have to say this about General Hodges. I mean, I see this many times in legal work that advocates, and he has been an advocate for Ukraine, advocates become so involved sometimes in the case of their clients that they do lose sight of reality. They continue to believe that things are going well, even when everybody around them can see that they are not. And they come up with all kinds of irrational or disconnected from reality explanations about why things are not turning out as they assume. So, it's not that the Ukrainians weren't winning, it's because somebody switched off their intelligence. I mean, something of that kind, which is, by the way, if you know anything about the fighting in Kursk, you know that is completely absurd.
See, if anyone gives that the least amount of examination, what he said there is like, oh, wait a minute, U.S., because Trump did. He temporarily, I forget the number of days, it was some number of days, he turned it off. But then again, you have to say, hang on, there's a 2,000-kilometer front altogether, north to south in this kind of thing. And did we see it fall apart anywhere else during those times? Or maybe could it have something to do with that Russia used this 3 weeks in the planning incredible operation where they went through a gas pipeline to break into the rear, and that suddenly caused the whole thing to collapse. I don't think that our intelligence would have been able to see him going through a metal pipeline to get into the back. So he's got to answer that one.
Well, absolutely. But as I said, people do this. I have to say, I'm a bit shocked that a general of, I believe he's in the U.S. Air Force.
No, he was the commanding general of the U.S. Army Europe. I mean, one of the highest ranking positions in Europe.
Well, there you go. I mean, that does stun me. I have seen this, as I said, with lawyers sometimes, but they tend to be rather bad lawyers, just to say, who become over-invested in the case of their client and lose the ability to give objective and impartial advice. I'm surprised, as I said, to see such a senior military officer lose that connection to reality. But there it is. I mean, so much about this whole conflict has been a flight from reality engaged in by so many people. You'd have thought that a general would be an anchor holding us to reality, but it seems not.
Gary,
You know
let
what I
me
think
ask you
a part-
something, because you worked in,
you know-
you're in regular media for a long time. You worked with Fox News for, I think, like 17 years. So you understand how the media landscape works. One of the things that puzzled me about General Hodges, because he has been spectacularly wrong on the biggest issues of this war. For example, as late as July of 2023, when their Ukraine offensive was clearly had been a complete failure, he still
Crimea.
said Ukraine would be in Crimea before
Crimea.
the end of August. He actually said that. And yet I still see him going on like CBS News, some of the big stations here. So it's like, how does he keep having credibility to be having a camera put in his face?
Yeah, he's got a good PR person, a good booker. I think they go after gravitas, Danny. So anybody that has any credential at any point in time, they remain there. That's why you see, you name it. Go down the list. Leon Panetta, all the other, war horses that have been on or in any of the administrations. They're happy to have them. They must be experts because they were there once. So. We're going to listen to them and not to what the reality on the ground is. Danny, I think the other dynamic that's unfolding, it's been unfolding since the beginning, is that, the West doesn't quite understand Russia's war machine or the special operations machine. It just moves way too slow for them. If Russia really, was as strong as they say they are, and if they are as powerful as they claim to be, they would have had this done already. But the way that Putin is going about this, trying to minimize losses on his end, and the way he's gone through the territories, it's not fast enough for them. So they think it's ineptitude and or weakness, or name the other things that they try and put upon Putin. And so it's not moving fast enough for them. They've got to lose because they're not moving fast to begin with.
I can only agree that must be what people are thinking. And I know for sure, I've talked to a number of people in the United States, people who are largely on our side, say the same thing. Well, Russia's, they're a crap military anyway. The fact that they can only take whatever it is, 22% of the country after 3 years of fighting against a backwards military of Ukraine, which of course that doesn't stand up to scrutiny, because this military is the biggest army in Europe outside of Russia, and they're backed by 50 nations in the West. So not quite the right description here, but Alexander, I've talked to some Russians, some sources that I have that claim that there is some supreme frustration among many of the senior ranking and lower ranking people on the Russian side, because they say that this nibbling at the edge is driving them crazy, because they said they have substantial combat power to completely overwhelm the Ukraine side and could win the war. But they say that they're being held back by Putin so far to see if these negotiations can work, because he doesn't want any more destruction or death on either side of the line. But the assumption is that if he doesn't get these negotiations, they don't go where he wants them to, he may pull the reins back or pull the leash off, and we could see a big operation. Do you hear anything like that from your sources?
Absolutely. You come across, it's not just in the sources, it's in open Russian media, as I should say, probably explained, not as you have explained it, your sources explained it to you, because people don't want in wartime to appear to be openly critical of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, as they refer to him. But undoubtedly that frustration does exist. And what you do see, and a reflection of it, is that Putin trusts the Americans too much. He's too wedded, as they see it, to diplomatic outcomes, and that instead of letting the military go ahead and sort this out as he should do, he's still seeking to find some kind of compromise, some kind of sustained compromise with the Americans. And earlier today on the Duran, it hasn't yet appeared, but we were very privileged to speak with a Russian, a very senior person within the Russian system called Andrei Kortunov. And he actually has written articles defending Putin's stance and say, look, the fact that he is seeking compromise, he's not doing this because he's soft or because he's letting the Americans trick him. He's doing it because he understands that Russia's national interest is to try to come to some kind of understanding with the United States, because Russia really cannot afford or cannot risk a prolonged confrontation with the United States on its western borders, which will prevent the country from pursuing its own economic development. So that debate does exist in Russia. And I think this is a key thing for people to understand in the West as well. In Russian terms, Putin is a moderate. It's not what you hear people say in the West.
Right.
But if it was left to the military by themselves, if it was left to a large and very vociferous section of Russian society, this war would be conducted in a very, very different way. And we would not be having the president of Russia talking in such a friendly way with the president of the United States as we're seeing now.
We are, yeah. And that's been one of the things that surprised a lot of people. But unfortunately, my worry is that restraint by Putin is being misinterpreted as weakness on our side. And I think that's
Definitely.
what encourages a lot of these people to keep going in providing all this ammunition, weapons, because they think they can do so cost-free, that there's no cost to them to do so, even if they can't reach the $40 billion level or whatever they're asking for. But that also has implications, I think, for Volodymyr Zelensky, because he also views it as weakness, I think, and thinks that he can get more power over his shoulder. I want to show you one more clip here because this didn't get a lot of press, and I'm a little bit surprised because it's kind of an in-your-face insult to Trump, the only one who's given a lifeline to this guy, but he seems to be complaining about the ceasefire.
Ми запропонували з самого початку припинення вогню в небі і на морі, тому що це не так складно контролювати, як перший крок, тому що не вірили, що русські підуть на будь-яке припинення вогню, тому що, на нашу думку, вони хочуть продовжувати нас знищувати, хочуть продовжувати війну, якщо коротко говорити. Але американська сторона нам сказала, ні, вони хочуть закінчити війну. Ми хочемо закінчити війну, тому хто буде сперечатися, давайте швидше тоді робити відповідні кроки. І на зустрічі в Джеді американська сторона зробила стрибок або крок вперед, швидкий, і сказала, давайте все-таки говорити не часткове припинення вогню, а припинення всюди. А після цього був контакт американців і русських, і знов люди зробили, мені здається, крок назад, тому що заговорили про часткове припинення вогню.
So just to summarize there, and if anybody couldn't read those words at the bottom of the screen, he's virtually saying, hey, we talked about a limited ceasefire at first, but for some reason the president didn't want to because he thinks Russia wants to end the war. Russia doesn't want to end the war. And then they took it forward anyway. They tried to get the full ceasefire. Then it didn't work. They took a step back. And so if they had just listened to us before, things would be a lot better. But here's the problem. Russia does want to end the war. They are willing to talk, negotiate a settlement. But if he keeps going, then I think that restraint that I talked about, because I know for sure, just from looking at the reports that we see out in open source and the military summary and some others that has a very transparent view of the battlefield, Russia has the capacity and can unleash it if Putin comes to the conclusion that negotiations won't work.
Oh, this is absolutely correct. I mean, this is, if we have to be straightforward about this is Ukraine's last chance to survive and prosper as an independent nation. And a responsible Ukrainian leader would be seizing it with both hands and working with President Trump in order to secure that peace and that future for his country. In fact, what you see is Zelensky being extremely frustrated and angry. His idea for a partial ceasefire was in effect a no-fly zone. I mean, that's what it looks like to me. We have complete cessation of activity in the air. This is not the ceasefire that we now have, and you didn't get.
Well put.
He didn't want a total ceasefire. Why? Ukraine benefits from a total ceasefire, but he didn't want that. He pushed back against that. He wanted security guarantees to have with the ceasefire. He is not acting in a responsible way. And I think you go back, I think the points that just been made previously, that people see Putin as somehow weak, goes a long way to explain this, because Zelensky sees these signs of restraint on the Russian side, and he doesn't understand them. He sees them as weakness, and he's convinced himself, and he's not the only person, that if the West pushes back, if it launches missiles into Russia, if it threatens Russia, if it imposes more sanctions, then sooner or later he'll get what he wants, when in reality he will get the opposite. My own personal view here is that when President Trump said that his major difficulties are not with the Russians, but with the Ukrainians, he is actually right. And he will continue, he will find that that is a continuing problem throughout the process. The Russians, Putin wants peace. Not everybody in Russia, to be clear, but Putin himself does. He wants peace because he's looking beyond this current war. He says to his people, we need a relationship with the United States. It doesn't mean we need to trust them on everything or agree with them on everything, but we have to look to our own future. And our own future is better if we have an understanding with the Americans than if we have the Americans as our enemy on our western borders and in all sorts of other places. So that's what Putin is thinking. Zelensky is not thinking in that way. He wants to win a war, which by now has become unwinnable.
It has. And,
Yeah,
and
okay,
Gary, I want to
Alexander.
look at the other half of that equation there, because you've been following Trump, obviously at Fox and elsewhere, and just in your own personal convention for quite a long time. Do you think that, two questions actually. First of all, how long do you think Trump is going to have patience with this guy when he basically contradicts him in public like he did in that clip yesterday?
Well,
no, go ahead.
No, I mean, I
just
just quickly say I was horrified by that side. But Gary, tell us.
Yeah, I think he's fed up with him. I think he's exercising more control than he normally would, Trump, because he really does want to end this war. And I'm with Alexandra. Just like you said, Zelensky says he wants to end this war. He doesn't want to end this war. I agree with you. And I think if they get a peace deal, he's going to revert back to what he's been saying in Callas and van der Leyen, everybody, that we can't trust Putin. Yes, we've got a signed document. I know, but they're not going to. They're going to proceed with their arms building and their production on their side to make sure that the ammunition and all the other arms, drones and everything else, are being produced in Ukraine. So I think they're going to revert back to that, saying that yes, we've got this document, but we can't trust them, so we're going to keep moving forward anyway. Okay, so separate but related question. If Trump, and if we can all agree, and I think we do, that both Trump and Putin do want to end this war, aside from what the other pressures are in there, if Zelensky continues to be a stick in the mud, how long do you think it will be before Trump finishes with his patience and just cuts him loose? Or do you think he will?
I think there's a good chance that he may. By the way, there's very great fear on the part of some people in Europe that is exactly what he's going to do. It's the people who worry about this, by the way, rarely say, well, in that case, let's try and get behind this process. But I cannot imagine that President Trump, who has an enormously ambitious agenda to fulfill in the United States as well, who is the leader of a country with interests and responsibilities right across the globe, is going to tolerate this obstruction from the Ukrainians indefinitely. If the Ukrainians won't help themselves, then there is a limited amount that Donald Trump and the United States can do anyway. And President Trump will say, enough's enough. I've done what I can. It's time for me to move on.
Absolutely. I think Trump's vision of the world and how things are going to move forward is so much bigger and grander, and it obviously because of who he is, than Zelensky's is. So I think his vision will ultimately, maybe not steamroll, but certainly it'll have so much momentum ultimately.
It may steamroll.
Yeah, well, you're right. You're right. He'll end up as a roadkill.
Yeah, that would be an ugly roadkill, something that doesn't need to happen, but could. Alexander, in the last few minutes we have here, I don't want to steal any thunder here, but because it hadn't aired yet. But what was the bottom line of your your Russian guest on your show? How does he see this ending?
Well, he is somebody who is determinedly optimistic about this. And I mean, what he said is that obviously we've got reasons to be very careful in Russia. We've got to be cautious. But this is an opportunity that we must seize when we are presented with opportunities to repair our relations with the United States. We must seize them because it is in our interests too. So I think he too is looking beyond Ukraine, if I could say. I think he understands that Russia is, he said so, that Russia is in a far stronger position than it used to be in the 1990s. Ukraine, in terms of improving relations with the United States, is an obstacle, but it is an obstacle that can be bypassed. And the main goal is to achieve that improvement in relations with the United States. So I think he's cautiously optimistic as well, but he does not speak for everyone in Russia. I mean, he's an academic. He is a person who writes on international affairs. He is a strategist. He's that kind of thing. If you talk to people in the military, if you talk to people on the streets, they will probably give a very different view.
Alexander, when is that going to premiere on your channel?
Oh, a couple of days, I think. It's
okay, because we will.
Yeah.
Oh, good. And anybody
Well,
that's
what
not
I
familiar
can
with
do-
Alexander,
What I can do, if you
anybody
please-
that's not familiar with Alexander's show, we'll have the link in the description, so it's already there for you, so you can go follow up on that show.
Right.
Yeah, we'll definitely be watching for that one, though. I'm really eager to see that one. Well, thank you, Alexander, for coming on today. And as always, in very eloquent ways, you just cut to the chase. You show what's real and what's not. We're excited to watch your show coming up, too. But thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you very much for having me. And it's always a great pleasure and very stimulating to have these conversations, I have to say.
It is indeed for us as well. Well, we're all going to be paying attention to what comes out of Saudi Arabia on Monday next week on the 24th. We will definitely be covering that because both Russia, Ukraine, and the United States will all be in the same building. And we're not sure how that's going to work out, but something's going to work out, and we'll be here to cover it for you. And we thank you and look forward to seeing you back on a future episode of the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.